The Meridian's pride didn't so much glide through the void as it rattled through it. Deep in the belly of the mid-sized freighter, 10 tons of neodymium and terbium vibrated in their canisters, a dissonant chord against the bone-deep thrum of the sublight engines. They were loud. They leaked heat like a cracked radiator and filled the ship with the faint odor of hot rubber. Captain Riley Foster gazed at her diagnostic screen, a ceaseless waterfall of green text around her. The bridge was a cacophony of normalcy. The comms channels were a messy soup of routine chatter. Crew members were arguing over dinner. Somewhere in the vents, a loose strut was rhythmically clanging like a funeral bell. Captain, for the third time, Specialist Miller is requesting a democratic vote on the dinner synthesis. Barnaby's AI voice cut through the cabin, his synthetic baritone competing with the upbeat synthesized thud of a century-old pop song blasting from the galley speakers. He claims the Nutri-Loaf is an affront to both God and palate. Shall I remind him he is in deep space or simply mute his terminal? Tell Miller if he wants a 5-star meal, he can hop out and walk to the nearest colony, Riley muttered, her thumb absent-mindedly clicking a pen in time with the music. A sudden burst of static erupted as the ship's proximity sensors tripped over a piece of space debris, promptly rendering it harmless with a pulse of plasma. Riley leaned back, rubbing her temples as the sheer, unrelenting noise of human existence, the music, the bickering, the roaring machinery, swirled around her. It was loud, messy, and perfectly routine. Riley's pen stopped clicking. On the main console, the waterfall of green text stuttered. "Barnaby," Riley said to the ship's AI, her voice sounding unnervingly crisp. "Report. Did the drives finally give up the ghost?" "Negative, Captain. Systems are functional, however. I am experiencing a lack of input." Barnaby's voice lacked its usual digital warmth. It sounded thin, like a recording played from a great distance. The long-range scanners report a localized distortion. At first I flagged it as a sensor ghost, but the ghost is growing. Hunger, convergence, the ripple. We moved through the fold of the graviton, draped in the velvet of non-existence. To exist was to be seen. To be seen was to be consumed. Our ancestors had survived by becoming the absence of light, by mastering the art of the null space. We tracked the infinitesimal vibrations of a single hydrogen atom. We tasted the faint, dying heat of ancient stars. But this thing was an obscenity, confusion, static, abrasive. It screamed across every spectrum, a mindless rhythmic roar that bruised our sensory membranes. It did not hide, it did not drift. It marched through the void with the grace of a crumbling mountain, trailing a wake of burning gases and frantic, senseless patterns of electricity. Riley leaned into the flickering glow of the primary sensor array. At first glance, it looked like a standard hardware glitch, a patch of dead pixels in the center of the display. But as she adjusted the frequency, the chill in her chest deepened. The background radiation in that region was fading, being pulled toward the center of the anomaly. "Captain," Barnaby's voice surged with a sudden spike of electronic feedback. "Power levels in the secondary batteries are dropping. I am detecting a massive localized drain. The local electromagnetic field is hemorrhaging toward the anomaly." The ship's lights flickered, dimming to a sickly amber. The noise of the engines had shifted from a dull roar to a desperate metallic whine, struggling against an invisible tide. Riley's skin prickled. There was no vessel on the screen, no debris, just a hungry, silent gap in reality where information went to die. "Captain," Barnaby's voice was a rasp of data packets, struggling to stay coherent. "I am detecting a localized gravitational lensing event. Light is bending. G-mu is spiking, but there is no mass signature, no heat, no radiation. It is a ghost with the weight of a mountain." Why does it bleed light so carelessly? We closed the distance, our lensing fields bending the very fabric of the sector to remain hidden. We expected the prey to go dark as well. We expected it to fold its wings and vanish into the cold cloak of its stealth defenses. Instead, it grew louder. It pulsed with music, a chaotic,
repetitive vibration that served no biological purpose. It broadcast its position to the entire quadrant, a beacon of vulnerability that felt like a trap. Strike, piercing, the void needle.
Riley stared at the main viewer. The stars warped, stretching into elongated ribbons of light, as if a magnifying glass were being dragged across the velvet of space. It was moving, and fast, closing the distance with a predatory, silent grace that defied every law of ballistics Riley knew. Evasive thrusters, burn to. She never finished the command. There was no explosion, no flash of plasma, and no roar of a missile. Instead, there was a sickening vibratory thunder that shook the marrow of her bones. A projectile, cold and invisible to every sensor on the Meridian's pride, had punched through the hull like a needle through silk. The ship groaned. A long, screeching metal-on-metal wail signaled a catastrophic breach. On Riley's console, a dozen red icons bloomed like bloodstains. Hull integrity compromised. Section 12G. Atmospheric pressure dropping at 4% per minute. The shouting of the crew was overwhelmed by the terrifying high-pitched whistle of air escaping into the vacuum. Atmospheric venting in the secondary mineral hold. Barnaby shouted over the rising wail of the depressurization sirens. "A projectile has passed clean through the ship, Captain." "Seal the bulkheads. Full power to the lateral thrusters." Riley slammed her fist onto the manual override. The Pride was a freighter built for steady hauls and heavy lifting, not for the high G-turns of a dogfight. The ship shuddered as the massive, inefficient engines fought to pivot the bulk of the ship. The ship lurched, the deck tilting at an agonizing angle as Riley fought the controls. Outside, in the darkness, the stars continued to warp and dance, the only sign that the invisible hunter was circling back for a second pass. "Barnaby, hit the high-gain array. Broadcast on all emergency frequencies, UEC military, civilian distress, even the automated buoy network. If it can carry a signal, I want us on it." Riley's voice was strained, her lungs already beginning to labor as the atmospheric pressure in the bridge ticked down to 82%. The Meridian's Pride shuddered again, the groan of its structural ribs sounding more like a wounded animal than a machine. "Transmitting now, Captain," Barnaby replied. His voice was flickering, a strobe light of audio. "Broadcasting. SOS. Coordinates. Pride. Help." Riley watched the signal monitors. On a normal day, the screen would show a clean, outgoing sine wave, a golden thread reaching out to the nearest quantum relay buoy. The monitor showed waves leaving the ship, but then they were stretching, curving back toward the invisible point of the gravitational anomaly, as if being sucked into a drain. "Captain, still no response from the military liaison," Barnaby said. "And the relay buoys are failing to mesh up. No handshake, like they're being jammed." "It's consuming the transmissions," Riley whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on her neck. "It's not jamming us, Barnaby. It's eating the light. It's eating the radio waves." The ship's air scrubbers kicked into a high-pitched whine, trying to compensate for the vacuum suck of the breach in Section 12G. A red warning light bathed the bridge in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. In the distance, through the reinforced viewports, Riley saw the stars smear again. The invisible predator was banking, circling back for the killing blow. "Captain, hull integrity is failing in the lower decks. If we do not seal the leak, you will lose consciousness in 6 minutes," Barnaby reported, his core processors clearly diverted to managing the ship's failing life support. "And I should inform you, the anomaly is accelerating. It has found our scent." The Pride was alone. No cavalry was coming, because the cavalry couldn't even hear their cries. "Abandon ship," Riley said. The words felt like lead in her mouth, colder than the vacuum currently gnawing at the Meridian's Pride. "Barnaby, initiate the scattershot protocol. Manual overrides on all escape pods. We aren't staying together." "Captain, the probability of recovery for a single occupant escape pod in this sector is—" "I know the math, Barnaby," Riley barked. "But that thing out there is hunting a freighter. It's hunting us. If we break into 20 different directions, it may not get to us all. It's the only way anyone gets home." In the belly of the ship, crew members scrambled into the narrow coffin-like cylinders of the life pods. There was no time for long goodbyes, only the frantic hiss of pressurized seals and the terrified muffled shouts of, "See you on the other side." Some pods were launched toward the inner system, their engines flaring bright white against the dark. Others shot downward relative to the galactic plane, spiraling like seeds in a gale. The remainder fired in a chaotic spread, each one immediately chirping its own high-frequency SOS. One by one, the thump hiss of the pneumatic launchers vibrated through the floorboards. Riley stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display turn into a scatterplot of outgoing dots. 20 lives, 20 signals, 20 chances. "One pod remains, Captain," Barnaby whispered, his voice now a mere thread of static. "I have transferred my core heuristic to your personal pod. 01. The Pride is now empty." Riley dove into the last pod, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in her teeth. "Barnaby," Riley whispered, her hand hovering over the final launch sequence. "The ship's automated defense protocols. Override the safety inhibitors on the plasma batteries." "Captain, the thermal recoil will liquefy the firing chambers within 90 seconds. Barnaby's voice was faint in the pod's headset, and our accuracy against a cloaked lensing target is mathematically negligible. It's cover fire. Barnaby, fire everything. Maximum spread. Don't stop until the barrels melt or the core gives out." "Acknowledged, Captain. Initiating the grave light sequence. We are prepared to launch." "Launch," she commanded. The G-force slammed her into the seat as Pod 01 kicked away from the dying freighter. As she spun away, Riley looked through the tiny porthole. The Meridian's Pride sat alone in the dark. Just then, the ship's twin plasma turrets, designed for clearing space debris and little else, shrieked to life. They didn't fire aimed pulses. They vomited concentrated bolts of ionized gas in a 360-degree sphere of white-hot violence. The surrounding space, once a clean canvas of stars, was suddenly a blinding strobe of violet and gold. Even in the vacuum, the sheer energy discharge rattled the teeth of every crew member in their distant pods. The void where the hunter lurked was suddenly illuminated, not by a hit, but by the silhouette it cast against the chaotic backdrop of fire. For a split second, Riley saw it, a shimmering, jagged ripple in reality, like a crack in a mirror, caught in the crossfire of the plasma barrage. It flinched.
The projectile was launched, a sliver of dense matter, invisible and cold. It struck the metal shell. We waited for the prey to become still, to enter the silent panic of the dying. Instead, it shattered. The large scream of the vessel broke into 20 tiny shrieks, like a seed pod bursting. The creature threw pieces of itself into the dark. Each piece began its own symphony of noise pings, pulses, frantic bursts of data that cluttered the serene silence of the deep. Hesitation, sensory overload, the many path. We drifted in the wake of the dying giant, our lensing fields flickering as we tried to process the sheer hubris of the act. Why would anything choose to be this loud? To broadcast its fear so vibrantly in the expanse of the deep? Silence was life. This prey was something else, a creature that defined itself by its noise. Pursuit? Which echo do we silence first?
The Pride was a shattered husk, its plasma batteries finally slagging into molten silence, but the void didn't return to the silence the hunters craved. It started in Pod 04 Specialist Miller, drifting alone in a pressurized tin can with the oxygen scrubber, hissing a steady rhythmic leak, keyed his wideband comms. He wasn't calling for help. He was breathing heavily, a wet, jagged sound of sheer terror. Then he began to hum. It was the terrible upbeat pop song from the galley, the one everyone had complained about an hour ago. "If I'm going out," Miller's voice crackled over the emergency frequency, "I'm not doing it in silence. You guys hear me?" A second of static followed. Then a burst of defiant feedback from Pod 9. "I hear you, Miller. That song is still trash. Play the one with the heavy bass." One by one, the 20 pods began to sing. They didn't use the secure and coded channels of a military retreat. They opened every valve, every frequency, and every gain knob they had. The entire crew joined in, humming, singing, and beatboxing old Earth synth-pop tunes.
Agony, fragmentation, the laceration of sense. The deep was no longer ours. The prey had not merely broken, it had transformed the vacuum into a jagged, multicolored landscape of noise. We who evolved to hear the whisper of a photon were being flayed alive by the music. The vibrations weren't just data, they were heavy. The low-frequency bass from the pods acted like physical hammers against our lensing fields, causing our cloaks to ripple and fail in rhythmic pulses. The emotional noise, the high-pitched spikes of human fear, and the melodic weaving of their songs created a kaleidoscopic interference pattern that blinded our gravitational sight. We tried to focus on a single pod, to pinch out one flickering light. But as we approached, the noise became a physical barrier. The closer we got, the more the human broadcast saturated our sensors, overloading our neural clusters with useless, vibrant, nonsensical information. They were so loud we couldn't see them. They were so bright with life that they had become invisible to the masters of the dark. Our tactical logic was failing. Our processors attempted to triangulate the source of the noise, but the creature had turned the sector into a hall of mirrors. The signal, everywhere. The target, nowhere. We had to withdraw, to revise our approach.
Inside Pod 01, Riley Foster sat with her eyes squeezed shut, her hands death-gripped on the manual release. She was waiting for the hull to buckle, for the cold needle to pierce her heart, for the darkness to finally swallow her whole. Instead, the stars began to stop dancing. The terrifying ripple in reality that had been closing on the ship suddenly buckled. The gravitational lensing effect began to smooth out as the hunters pulled back. As the distance between the anomaly and the ship increased, the localized interference began to bleed away. On Riley's cramped dashboard, a single green light flickered to life. Then another, Captain. Barnaby's voice crackled through her headset, no longer a shredded wisp of data, but a steady companion. The lensing effect is receding. The dead zone around us is collapsing. We have signal egress. It started as a low-frequency buzz, the automated emergency beacon of the Pride finally finding a path through the static. Then, "Is that? Are you guys still singing?" A voice crackled over the comms, thin, shaking, but undeniably alive. It was Chief Engineer Halloway. "Is it gone?" Specialist Miller's voice burst through the comms. "I'm still here. Pod 04 is still here. Someone tell me I'm not the only one." "Shut up, guys. You're clogging the emergency band." A voice joined in, followed by 3 others, then 6, then 10. Every pod was chirping its own SOS. Every crew member was shouting, and the debris of the Pride was still screaming its broadband plasma song. Riley watched her tactical display. The anomaly was still barely visible, a faint, shimmering distortion about 10 light minutes out. But it was stagnant. It was hesitant. "Barnaby?" Riley whispered, her voice rasping in the recycled air. "Where did it go? Did the plasma hit it?" "Probability of a terminal hit is less than 0.03%, Captain," the AI's voice replied, sounding remarkably steady despite the low power mode of the pod. "However, the anomaly has moved beyond my detection range. It appears to have retreated." "Retreated?" Riley leaned her head back against the padded headrest, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. "We're in tin cans. We're defenseless. Why would it leave?" "I cannot provide a logical explanation based on known physics, Captain," Barnaby said, a touch of his usual wit returning. On the bridge of the UEC Iron Sovereign, the air was thick with the soft hum of professional discipline until the long-range arrays caught a spike. "Contact," a sensor technician called out, his fingers dancing across a glass console. "Emergency beacon detected in Sector 4G. Automated ID confirms it's the Meridian's Pride. Signal is weak but steady." Admiral Vance leaned over the tactical plot. The ship's AI immediately processed the telemetry, calculating the exact spatial coordinates for a high-precision intercept. Status of the vessel. "Integrity failing, Admiral. They've deployed pods. If we don't move now, We're looking at a recovery mission instead of a rescue. Understood, Vance said, his voice flat and decisive. Navigation, lock those coordinates. Spool the singularity drive. I want a tactical aperture open in 30 seconds. Deep within the Iron Sovereign, the wormhole generators roared to life, folding the fabric of space-time to bridge the trillion-kilometer gap. The ship's AI calculated the required energy for a stable Einstein-Rosen bridge, ensuring the exit aperture would open within visual range of the distress beacons. Wormhole stabilized, the navigator reported. Coordinates locked. Initiating transit. In a silent flash of displaced light, the massive prow of the heavy cruiser vanished from its station, plunging through the artificial rift.
The deep was not supposed to feel like this. The deep was a sanctuary of perfect equations, where the only movement was the slow, predictable drift of cold matter, and the only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of pulsar clocks. Pain overload, the shattering of the null. We, the architects of silence, found ourselves drowning in a sea of razor edges. The prey had not just failed to die, it had committed a sensory atrocity. Usually our prey is a single heavy stone dropped into a still pond. We track the ripples, we find the center, we consume the stone. But these creatures had turned the pond into a raging tempest of boiling acid. The music was the worst to the prey. It was a comfort ritual. To us, it was a structural assault on our lensing membranes. The repetitive, low-frequency vibrations, what they called a beat, acted as a rhythmic battering ram against our gravitational cloaks. Each thud forced our fields to expand and contract, expanding and contracting, until the very fabric of our stealth began to fray and smoke. And the voices, the overlapping, contradictory screams and melodies, were a chaotic tapestry that defied geometry. We tried to find the opening between their signals, the quiet spot where we could strike, but there was no quiet. They filled every gap, they saturated every frequency, they were broadcasting their memories, their fears, and their defiance in a blinding, multicolored spray that seared our neural clusters. Nausea, disorientation, the blind flight. We could no longer see the pods, not because they were hidden, but because they had become a singular, screaming entity that occupied all points in space simultaneously. It was a paradox we could not solve. How can something be so small, yet occupy so much of the spectrum? Sever, recoil, return to the cold.
The fabric of space-time, less than 10,000 kilometers off the Pride's starboard bow, began to liquefy. It twisted into a shimmering, violent funnel, a tactical wormhole aperture. From the white-hot center of the rift, the UEC heavy cruiser Iron Sovereign punched through, followed by a swarm of 56 kinetic frigates and electronic warfare corvettes. They did not arrive with stealth or subtlety. They arrived with the thunder of folding dimensions and the roar of 1,000 high-gain antennas, instantly flooding the sector. The electronic warfare corvettes immediately began poking at the dark, blasting active sensor pings so powerful they could be felt as physical taps against the hulls of the escape pods. Hundreds of encrypted military channels, tactical handshakes, and broad-spectrum jamming signals crisscrossed the space, turning the quiet graveyard into a digital hurricane. Dozens of fusion drives, masterpieces of loud human inefficiency, burned bright enough to be seen from the next star system.
We had endured the primary vessel's blinding flare, that desperate, terminal fire, but now we sought to pinch out the remaining sparks. Retrat, regroup. We prepared to circle around, to close in on the fragments, one by one, the tiny metal seeds that continued to spill their frantic melodic filth into the deep. Precision, the final pinch, the restoration of... Then the universe tore itself open. It was not a gradual event, it was a spatial seizure. A few hundred cycles of distance away, the fabric of the null did not merely bend, it shattered. A rupture of white-hot geometry vomited forth a legion of thundering monoliths. Agony, total neural collapse, the drowning. The arrival of the Great Fleet was not a visual event, it was a tectonic shift of information. If the first vessel had been a scream, this was the roar of a collapsing galaxy, dozens of heavy fusion cores ignited simultaneously, their thermal signatures blooming like malignant suns, searing our optic membranes. The new arrivals did not wait to see us. They hammered the void with massive, rhythmic walls of data that struck our lensing fields with the force of falling moons. Each ping was a physical blow, causing our gravitational cloaks to shudder and resonate until the very cells of our being vibrated in a serrated, dissonant harmony. Then they flooded the spectrum with 1,000 different voices, encryption keys, tactical handshakes. It was a hurricane of overlapping intent, a sensory flashbang that turned our hunting grounds into a kaleidoscopic nightmare of static. The dark is poisoned. We tried to maintain our symmetry, to hold the fold, but these creatures were champions of arrogant terror. They didn't just inhabit the space, they colonized the spectrum. They broadcast their presence with such violence that the very concept of stealth became a joke. We were masters of the subtle ripple. But how do you track a ripple in the middle of a typhoon? Our lensing fields collapsed entirely, the gravity-bending membranes turning inside out under the pressure of their unrelenting noise. For the first time in an epoch, we were visible, naked and trembling in the blinding glare of their fusion fire. Sever, retreat, the flight, the far dark. We did not look back. We folded ourselves into the smallest possible points of existence and fled. The sector was no longer a hunting ground. It was a graveyard of silence, occupied by creatures so fundamentally, aggressively loud that even the void itself seemed to flinch in their presence. We would never return. We would leave the deep to these things that could not help but scream.
On the bridge of the Iron Sovereign, Admiral Vance stared at the chaotic mess of human signals on a sensor screen. "Get those pods secured," Vance barked over the din of the bridge. "And someone tell whoever is playing that 21st century synth-pop to cut the feed. It's interfering with our telemetry." In Pod 01, Riley Foster watched the massive shape of the cruiser blot out the stars. The music over the comms didn't stop, though it just got louder as the rescue shuttles began to hail them. She leaned back, her ears ringing, her lungs burning, and a tired smile on her face. This new human universe was loud. It was messy. It was crowded. It was beautiful. Captain Riley Foster sat in the front row of the debriefing theater aboard the Iron Sovereign. On the massive holoscreen at the front of the room, a young military analyst tapped a glass pointer against a complex graph. "We are calling it the Foster-Miller maneuver," the analyst declared with professional awe. By distinguishing their emergency frequencies and layering nonlinear acoustic data, what we initially flagged as terrible pop music, the crew created a localized pocket of entropic interference. It was a masterstroke of electronic warfare. They essentially built a frequency-shifting stealth screen out of nothing but grit and salvaged comms gear. The reports being drafted for the UEC High Command were gems of accidental fiction. Acoustic decoupling strategy. What was actually Specialist Miller crying and singing to keep from hyperventilating? Dynamic thermal diversion. What was actually the Pride's inefficient engines leaking heat like a sieve because a coolant pipe had rattled loose 3 months ago? Psychological signal saturation. What was actually 20 terrified humans shouting over one another because they didn't want to die alone? "It wasn't a strategy," Riley muttered, but her voice was lost in the room's celebratory chatter. Beside her, Miller was leaning back, basking in the praise of a group of wide-eyed ensigns. "Yeah," Miller bragged. "I knew the rhythmic cadence of the bass would disrupt their lensing field. It was all about the hertz, man. All about the hertz." Riley sighed and rubbed her temples. She thought back to the anomaly. She remembered the way it flinched when the plasma fire started. The hunters were gone, their ancient, elegant biological sensors permanently traumatized by the Foster-Miller maneuver. Riley looked out into the black. She remembered the feeling of that void, the way it had moved with a terrifying mathematical elegance. It wasn't some monster from a holovid. It was an apex predator of the sublime. It was a creature of the perfect quiet, evolved to track a single heartbeat across a light year. It hadn't been defeated by a superior weapon or a more cunning mind. It had simply been offended, and it was still out there. She could feel it in the back of her mind, a vast cold hunger lurking just beyond the edge of their most sensitive long-range arrays. Riley leaned her forehead against the cool glass. She realized then that humans would never be the ghosts of the galaxy. They would never be the silent watchers or the masters of the subtle fold. They were a species of spilled coffee, bad pop songs, and emergency beacons left running, just in case. The strength of humanity wasn't in their ability to remain unseen. It was in their refusal to be ignored. "Keep singing, Miller," she whispered to the empty room, a small, tired smile touching her lips.